Awesome. Welcome everyone to the 2022 MIT Sustainability Summit. I'm Rachel Davidson, and this is my classmate, Austin Cole. We are the co-directors for content for this summit. We're just gonna give it a couple of minutes to let some people trickle in. As many of you might know, Sloan actually runs on Sloan time. Classes don't start until 5 minutes after the hour, so we're not gonna wait until 9:05, but we'll give people just a couple minutes to trickle in before we dive into our welcome. All right, we are going to get started. For anybody who just hopped on, welcome again, everyone, to the 2022 MIT Sustainability Summit. As you know, our theme is from the ground up, elevating grassroots action towards a just climate for all. I'm Rachel Davidson. This is Austin Cole. We're MBA 23s, and we're the two co-directors for content for this summit, and we're so excited to bring it to you. So before we begin, we would like to take a second to recognize the wider moment in the world that we're currently in. Really today, our hearts are with the people of Ukraine and with all people facing the abuse and destruction of invasion and oppression. From Yemen to Afghanistan, Colombia to Palestine, Somalia to Haiti, and everywhere in between. Their need for justice exists as part of the same systems that we'll discuss for the rest of the day. Diving into the introduction, into the theme of this summit, MIT students have planned and organized the summit for the past 13 years, but this is the first year that the theme focuses on environmental and climate justice. This concept is quite simple. It's that the irreparable harms from climate change and environmental degradation are not distributed evenly or fairly. Instead, they disproportionately impact those at the margins, from those in low-income communities to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to the disabled, to gender and sexual minorities, and to the people in the global South, among others. In the face of this reality, the summit aims to elevate the grassroots. And that's because too often, the groups that enable this environmental degradation while benefiting from its uneven distribution are the same groups providing solutions with similar blind spots. And so as a result, it often falls to marginalized communities to fend for themselves. And yet, to paraphrase the authors Zoe Samudzi and William C. Anderson, the responsibility for reversing the harm humans have caused to the environment should not rest with the oppressed peoples of the world who have contributed to it the least. So in today's summit, if you are in a position of privilege and power, as Austin and I are, as MBA students at one of the top academic institutions in one of the richest countries in the world, we will be challenging you to bridge that gap and take on some of the burden when you leave today. Because to be clear, environmental and climate justice is not a field or a facet of sustainability that we can just choose to engage with or not, if we as people and professionals wish to truly create a just and sustainable world. As we've taken to saying on our team, sustainability without environmental and climate justice really can't be sustainable.
With this in mind, we'd like to share a land acknowledgement that is on our summit website and was prepared by MIT's Dr. David Shane Lowry. The stolen land on which MIT sits is the traditional unceded territory of the Massachusetts tribe and our forced occupation extends to the lands of other tribal nations as well. We acknowledge the enduring relationship that exists between these sovereign nations and their traditional territories. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide within these territories. We seek to honor Indigenous peoples and learn from Indigenous scholars whose land and communities MIT has poisoned and profited from and ignored across what we now call the United States and Canada. Now, we want y'all to pause for a second and think about this land acknowledgement that we just read and what land means to each of us. How we survive and how we thrive is inextricably linked to land, the stolen land on which we reside, work, and live off of. Our futures are directly tied to our relationship with the land. And without thoughtful collaboration and collective action, the land which we have today will not be available to future generations. So in that vein, we also ask that you consider the following quote, describing a worldview that is likely, potentially, radically different from many of those of us tuning in today. Today, we hope that you go into each session really ready to challenge your own worldview and understand what that might mean. We also hope that the summit challenges the traditional bounds of what you consider sustainability or environmentalism. We want to ensure that when we talk about the climate crisis, environmental injustices, and real tangible harms, we're talking about power, about systemic disadvantage. We're talking about racism, genocide, and ongoing colonialism. We hope that you consider and perhaps reconsider your own relationship to the land under your feet and how that impacts the environment around you, as well as how you understand the world. And we hope that you take something compelling away from today, something that moves you to action. We also hope that you come with a spirit of openness and gratitude. We'll hear from some hard truths, but we'll also hear about powerful, innovative, and inspiring works from many of the people who are trying to remake the world.
So in terms of what today entails, we're going to start with a fireside chat between Julian Brave Noisecat, an Indigenous writer and activist, and Saif Rahman of Patagonia's environmental advocacy team. That's going to be followed by an address from Jade Begay and Kilea Frederick of the NDN Collective, who will open our grassroots organizational showcase. After lunch, we're going to hear from a panel of 6 extraordinary speakers on connecting the local and global. Then we're going to get our hands dirty in a workshop on non-exploitative allyship and corporate accountability. And finally, we'll wrap up with a series of calls to action and hear some closing remarks from our wonderful summit managing directors.
So,
before we move on to the summit, we want to share some reminders and guidelines. So first, we welcome everyone to join and participate in the summit as you'd like to. We're going to alternate between these bigger main room plenary sessions and more interactive ones where you'll have the opportunity to talk with some speakers and one another. We'd love to see your faces, but we also recognize that it's been a hard few years, and it's a snowstorm for folks in Massachusetts, so some people may not want to turn on their cameras. So we only ask that you be respectful of speakers and fellow participants, and remember to mute yourselves when you aren't speaking. Second, as we move through today's summit, we ask that you extend us some grace and patience, particularly with sessions 2 and 4, as we navigate our virtual platform. Ahead of every session, we'll be sure to provide detailed instructions on how to navigate to where you need to be.
So before we go, we'd like to extend an initial round of thank yous to everyone who made this summit possible. And we cannot do that without first acknowledging the early leaders of the EJ and related movements, largely Black organizers, activists, and environmentalists who have spent decades in this fight. Second, we are incredibly indebted to our partners and supporters, our advisors, our sponsors, our speakers, our incredible managing directors who led us through organizing during a pandemic, and our amazing, amazing content team and the extended summit team. You all made this possible. And with that, let's kick off an awesome day. So we would like to introduce our first speaker who will deliver a brief address on the work of Project Indigenous MIT, Dr. David Shane Lowry, who is MIT's Distinguished Fellow in Native American Studies. He is a member of the Lumbee tribe who trained as an anthropologist at MIT, and he focuses his research on how people and cultures heal. Dr. Lowry?
Yeah, thank you so much. That was, I appreciate you all welcoming all of us into this space in this room. I'm gonna take a few minutes, maybe 4 or 5 minutes to quickly introduce you all to what we as what I call Project Indigenous MIT are seeing and beginning to understand at this critical moment in history. Last year, or maybe in 2019, the MIT community began to very quickly move into a conversation about the third president of MIT, who we found out his name is Francis Walker. He basically was the face of genocide in the United States. He started the reservation system. He basically, as a statistician, wrote a book called The Indian Problem, which set aside time and energy in his otherwise interesting work to plan and to help the various institutions of the United States process a movement of American Indian Indigenous people into reservations across the United States. This work basically continued into the early 1900s, where he was advising state governments and universities on their work in various locations across the United States to remove the power of American Indian people, remove the sovereignty of those people to be able to speak, back to the colonial powers. Well, as we've been finding out this history, right, MIT hired me last year to come in and kind of direct the conversation. And to put it very simply, we found out that MIT was founded in the business of genocide. Various of our disciplines, from civil engineering to urban planning to the Sloan School of Management, where you're speaking from today, were born in the business of redirecting Native people into invisibility. Alfred Sloan, as you know, the founder of Sloan School of Management, he was at one time the director or the CEO of General Motors, and he was part of the business of what we call Indian termination, Indian relocation in the mid 20th century. And there was a famous line where Lee Iacocca, who worked for Chrysler, said, "Look what Alfred Sloan has gotten us into. He's made all of our auto manufacturing plants into little reservations because of the large number of Native people, American Indian people, that were moved into the auto manufacturing economy." This is a particularly interesting moment right now because Russia and Ukraine are in the middle of attention right now, and the world is in the middle of attention. But during World War II, we were training people in the Manhattan Project to create bombs at MIT. They learned and created and developed nuclear weapons that were then tested on indigenous people in the Pacific Ocean, specifically the people at Bikini Atoll. So as we move forward into a conversation, as you all today move forward into a conversation, I invite you all to consider MIT, not just in terms of this really, really bad sordid history that we need to really deal with, but in terms of it being a stage, MIT being a stage, and Sloan School of Management being a stage where we can collectivize and work towards not only a better future, but a future that allows various marginalized voices, especially indigenous voices, into the room to help direct our future making. Thank you.
We're going to get started with our first session. Before we can take action today, we have to understand the context and the history behind environmental justice. How do marginalized communities and grassroots organizations conceive of environmental justice? And how do private sector institutions? To explore some of these questions, we filmed a fireside chat between Julian Brave Noisecat and Saif Rahman, in which Saif interviewed Julian.
So a little bit about our speakers. So first of all, Julian, a writer and filmmaker, is a fellow of New America and the Type Media Center. He's a member of the Sipwepen and Staten tribes. Saif is an organizer, direct action trainer, and storyteller. He causes trouble alongside the environmental campaigns and advocacy team at Patagonia. Being the son of immigrants from Bangladesh and Pakistan and growing up Muslim in a post-September 11th world, he started to organize at a young age and is committed to strengthening social movements for racial, economic, and climate justice. He previously has been the social movements coordinator and associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, a steering committee member of United for Peace and Justice, and a co-director of the Resist Foundation. And his favorite things are nonviolent direct action, story-based communication strategies, remote outdoor places, and spicy vegan food. Cool. So we're going to share this pre-recorded fireside chat between Saif and Julian, which is wonderful. And then we're going to come back for a bit of Q&A with Saif and Julian, who will be joining us live.
Thank you.
Julian, so nice to meet you.
Great to meet you. So good to be here. Well, first I just want to say Chokwi Nuch, good morning, or as it literally translates in my Secwepemc language, you all survived the night. So everyone here at MIT survived the night. It's an important thing to acknowledge every morning. And I also just want to say that it's good to be here today on the lands of the Massachusetts people in what is now Cambridge.
I wonder if you can help the audience, connect a few of the dots here that might be, your journey is probably, as you said, like a different journey, a different trajectory than most folks that might be in the audience today. A lot of folks don't think of the climate movement or the environmental movement as a decolonial movement as well. And it seems like your entry point, as you said, was from an indigenous rights standpoint. And can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how did that connection happen when you were coming of age around these issues?
So for me, the primary concern actually at first when I was following what was going on with pipelines and mines and logging is a big thing in the area that my people come from in British Columbia, Canada. I'm Secwepemc and Statling, so the biggest industries in our area are logging and mining. And the primary concern for me was, whether Indigenous peoples had given our consent for these projects to move forward. In the part of Canada that my people come from, there were no treaties signed between, the King of England or the Queen or the Government of Canada and First Peoples to exchange the land or to, open up the land to settlement. In our view, and in also the view of the Supreme Court of Canada, Aboriginal rights and title, which is the sort of Canadian term for Indigenous rights to land, were not extinguished. So we consider our homelands to be unceded territories. This is a phrase that you might hear with respect to Indigenous lands quite often in different parts of North America and beyond. And so the primary concern that I had at first was, where my people come from, and also, across North America, you were seeing tribes and indigenous communities standing up and saying, we did not give our consent for this pipeline to be built here. We do not support this, and these are our lands. These are our lands according to this treaty or according to our traditions, and we are not in support of you, building this project that is going to also imperil our communities in the form of, threatening our drinking supply in the case of the Dakota Access Pipeline, or desecrating our sacred sites in the case of the Rio Tinto copper mine that is going to be built on the Apache sacred site in Oak Flat, et cetera, et cetera. Those were the kinds of issues that I was very focused on. So it was really about, what does it mean to give your consent to, live in the infrastructure of our society, right? And as Indigenous peoples, consent to the governed, that's like a very fundamental idea in democracy and political theory. But from an Indigenous perspective, we have never given our consent to not just specific projects, but to much of what has happened around us in society and in our world. And in the broadest sense, and I think that this actually is not just true for Indigenous peoples, we have not also given our consent to see the world around us fall into ruin. We have not given our consent to the collapse of our climate, to a reality where now there is, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is somewhere around 410 parts per million today. And that is the highest concentration of carbon dioxide that has existed since humanity came into existence, right? The last time that there was that much carbon in the atmosphere, there were forests on Antarctica, the Greenland ice sheet didn't exist, and sea levels were 50 to 100 feet higher than they are today. And that reality, the reality that not just indigenous peoples face, but all people face, is one that I don't think any of us have really consented to. It's one that has been through various economic processes, but also through various entrenched interests, and in particular the entrenched interests of the fossil fuel industry, one of the most powerful industries in the history of humanity, if not the most powerful industry in the history of humanity, has been foisted upon all of us. So I think from that perspective, the question of what do we all, as particular communities with the right to self-determine, but also as citizens of nations, and also as residents of this planet, what have we consented to? I think that that's a really fundamental question. And I think that if you approach environmental problems and the climate problem from that perspective, I think that is very much a perspective that, at least in my experience of the last 10, 20 years in my own life, very much comes out of the indigenous context and indigenous environmental justice movements.
Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Oakland, California. There's this thing, I guess it might be people might be confused. It's like, I said that my people are from British Columbia, Canada, and now I just said I grew up in Oakland, California. So let me explain that a little bit. There's this very little known thing called the Jay Treaty that had to do a lot more with a bunch of other things, but basically it was negotiated by John Jay. He was like the first governor of New York, so it bears his name. And in one provision of the Jay Treaty, which I think came about in like the late 1700s or something, it's part of this subset of negotiations around the founding of this country. Basically, there was an agreement that Native people, which at the time primarily was focused on the Haudenosaunee people in what is now upstate New York and sort of lower Canada, Quebec, Ontario, could cross the border, which was a very loose thing back then, between British Canada and the United States freely. And that provision in the Jay Treaty now allows First Nations people, so people with Native status in Canada, to travel to and live and work in the United States if we have a status card. So my father's an artist, and he went off to art school and then ended up actually getting a printmaking job in New York and moved to New York on our Jay Treaty rights, which is a native treaty right that we have here in North America. So that's how he ended up in the States and met my mom, who's Irish Jewish New Yorker. They actually met in a bar. I kind of feel like it could be a scene in like a Sherman Alexie novel or something, the scene of the two of them meeting. And then they had me, I guess, and my dad was an artist. They're no longer together. They split up when I was pretty young. But because my dad was an artist, they could move around for my mom's jobs, and my mom eventually got a job in the Bay Area. And so I ended up in Oakland, which, to me, Oakland is a huge part of who I am.
That's my next question.
Tons of people, exactly. Tons of people who I'm sure you work with in the environmental movement live in Oakland, in the Bay Area. Oakland has a really outsized role, I would say, in the social movements that have shaped the United States and beyond. So, the Black Panther Party was founded in Oakland. The United Farm Workers, Cesar Chavez actually was trained as a community organizer in the Fruitvale district of Oakland. There were the free speech movement at UC Berkeley. It was a huge part of the 60s. And very few people know this, but actually, in a lot of ways, what you might consider the origin of the native rights movement, the modern native rights movement in the United States and beyond, actually is also in Oakland and the Bay Area. So in 1969, a group of Native students and urban Native activists occupied Alcatraz Island, the site of the former federal prison, for 19 months. And that protest, which attracted national attention, was a really significant starting point. It's really kind of like I'd liken it to the Montgomery bus boycott in the civil rights movement. It was a starting point for the native rights movement, which really picked up steam in the 70s and then won a number of sort of policy and legal victories in the 70s and 80s. And that happened right in Oakland and the Bay Area. A lot of people don't know that. Even a lot of people who live in Oakland and the Bay Area actually don't know that. And that was a huge part of the community that I grew up in. A lot of the elders in the Oakland Native community, which was actually very significant. There's a significant urban Native population in Oakland and the Bay Area. A lot of people don't know that either. The third oldest urban Native community center, called the Intertribal Friendship House, the third oldest urban Native community center in the country is in Oakland. It's called the Intertribal Friendship House. And I grew up going there. They have drum and dance practice on Thursday nights. And at the end of drum and dance practice, we'd sing the American Indian Movement song. And there were elders, and there still are elders, although there's a lot fewer now today, who remembered and were part of the Alcatraz occupation and would share their memories of that occupation. And I say all of that just to, I guess, give a sense of the community that I grew up in, and this feeling that I had from a very young age as a Native person that I wanted to learn and also be part of that tradition. That was very much the intent of having us all gather around the drum, for example, and sing the American Indian Movement song. The point of that was that we were, as the next generations of Native people, supposed to be carrying on and literally still singing and participating in the traditions of activism and movement that our elders and prior generations had put before us. So yeah, Oakland's a huge part of who I am and how I ended up in a roundabout way engaged in, sort of broadly speaking, the push for social change, and in particular the indigenous and environmental justice sort of pieces of that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, at Patagonia, one of the things we're really wrestling with right now is sort of our history as a company being primarily white-led, and how our view of environmentalism and our view of conservation has been through a white lens. I'm wondering, from your experience, where do you see the environmental and climate justice movement today in sort of their understanding of intersectionality, in the biggest challenges you see to it, primarily in terms of the mainstream, right? The one that gets the photo ops on the front page of the New York Times, are represented by big green groups that are primarily white-led, have all white boards, have lots of money, get their donors from wealthy white folks, versus the folks that have been on the ground in frontline communities that have been doing this work in rural and urban settings for decades now. And there seems to be a moment right now, right, where a lot of those white-led organizations, traditional white-led organizations, are sort of having a moment of not an identity crisis, but in some ways it kind of is, realizing that with environmentalism without a racial justice lens is just white supremacy, right? Where do you see the movement? Where do you see the biggest challenges right now?
So I just want to emphasize the first point in your question, right, which is the whiteness of the environmental movement. There is this sort of myth of the origin of the national parks and sort of conservation in America, where Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir go on essentially a camping trip, right?
Yep.
And in that myth, you know, this is not true, but they may as well also be like wearing Patagonia vests, right?
Yep.
And like that's kind of the vibe of conservation and the environmental movement up to today, right? Like this is still a big part of the dominant and more well-funded part of the green thing that exists in American society and in the world of nonprofits, et cetera. You know, I think that the key, to me, the most simple way to understand the intervention that indigenous people, people of color, workers, and what would now be identified as the environmental and climate justice movement is making into that space is essentially about placing people and humanity in the context of their environment, understanding that those actually are not separable. Because in the conception, right, of John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt and sort of this traditional conservation environment model, the idea was that humanity and man and people and community could be separated from nature and environment, that nature and environment was something out beyond in a place like Yosemite or Yellowstone that needed to be preserved so that mostly white men, you know, and mostly white upper class men could go, you know, march through nature and appreciate and understand the importance of the natural world to their masculinity and you know, a very limited conception of humanity. And I think that very basic philosophic move to separate humanity from nature, I think undergirds a lot of that subset of environmental thinking. And essentially what, you know, long tradition, which you could trace back to the origins of the term environmental justice, which is really a post-civil rights phrase. But you could also see, I think, even before in lots of other social movements and lots of other statements by various communities that were impacted by very significant forms of environmental devastation and degradation and pollution, is essentially this insistence that no, in fact, you know, our community, our people are not distinct from the environment we live in. We are directly impacted by the environment we live in. You know, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the quality of the land where we're going to grow our food, all of these things are impacting us. You know, they sometimes actually literally go inside of our bodies, right, and impact our health. And so many other things, and our opportunities, and our places of work, all of that. And I think that it's taken a very long time for environmentalism to integrate that central idea, which I think at the end of the day is a pretty simple idea. It's the idea that, again, you know, we cannot separate humanity from its environmental, its ecological, its climate context.
I'd love to explore that a little bit more. Let's demystify that myth. I think it's a really interesting story that's not really told. You know, Black and brown and poor communities have always, since the beginning of time, right, been organizing to protect their homes and their lands and the environment. And at some point in history, this white, you know, the John Muir myth comes into play to sort of take over in some ways. What do you think are the biggest challenges, not just a demystifying that history, but in terms of today, in terms of power, in terms of, you know, the reason climate change is happening or is able to happen is because in order for there to be a changing climate, there needs to be disposable places. And if there's disposable places, there's disposable communities. So help us understand a little bit of where you see that those movements, the movements for gender justice, for racial justice, the struggle for decolonization, meeting with the environmental movement, and what do you see some of the biggest opportunities are and some of the biggest challenges?
Well, firstly, I think that there's institutional form of transformation that is desired. There's consistently a report that comes out every year or a few years that basically provides statistics on leadership of green groups and environmental organizations, and sort of measures that against diversity in broader society, and quite consistently, though things have been improving in recent years, the environmental movement is whiter than broader society, and in particular the leadership of the environmental movement is whiter than broader society. And at the most fundamental level, I think it's very easy for people to understand that institutions are the ways that we create structures and organizations to take actions that shape society or manage particular things and issues, right? And if those institutions are being run and managed by primarily, white people, then, there is clearly sort of institutional and structural bias about, whose interests are, broadly speaking, and whose perspectives, broadly speaking, are going to be catered to a certain extent by those structures and institutions. And so on the most basic level, I think that there's a desire for more diverse leadership in the existing institutions of the environmental movement. Beyond that, though, I think that there's also questions about what sorts of, and I think that this is actually sort of a more challenging subset of problems for the environmental movement. But there are questions, I think, about what specifically are the problems that need to be identified and measured, right? So in the broadest sense, there are a number of different pieces of any community or society's environmental portfolio that could be addressed at any given time. You could choose, for example, to focus on maintaining parks, or building more electric vehicle charging infrastructure, or focusing on the share of renewables in the energy grid, or right now in front of Congress there is a bill that's being considered, and there are different trade-offs that will be made about exactly how much of the country's lead pipes will be replaced with pipes that are safe for drinking water to flow through. And all of those decisions at the end of the day reflect the priorities of, in theory, our society and democracy, but in reality, reflect the priorities of the more powerful people within our society and democracy. And I think what is also being desired from the subset of people who want more racial justice, more gender justice, more indigenous sovereignty, et cetera, from the environmental movement is a reordering and re-identifying of what the priorities should be when we relate to and manage and establish the ways that we're going to govern and be in relationship with the natural world, broadly speaking. And then I think a question arises as to whether or not, in order to achieve those aims, this is a bit conceptual as well, we need different institutions, or we need different ways to measure various problems. And you see this on the most basic level in the rise of organizations since the 1960s and 1970s that are dedicated to environmental justice, right? That are dedicated to addressing the problem of disproportionate pollution falling on impoverished communities that are primarily communities of color, right? There's a whole subset of organizations that have come into existence that are focused on that problem and that subset of problems specifically. And why did those institutions come into existence? Because the existing ones were not paying enough attention to that problem. It's pretty straightforward. And so, I think that those are the questions. There's the how do we transform the existing institutions, and one way is, to put new leadership at the helm of them, and that is something that I do believe can help make a difference. And then there's the other questions of, what are the problems that these institutions are not addressing, and in some instances do we need new organizations and institutions to address those? And I think that those are all strategies that I see people working for climate and environmental justice employing.
Mm-hmm. So for folks in the audience, a lot of folks are probably thinking about what they're going to do next in life. And a common theme, obviously, that we've been touching upon is, especially in the environmental world, is the road to hell is always paved with good intentions. So a lot of folks come into the movement, want to do good work, have the absolute best intentions, big hearts, but often take steps that harm folks or harm communities unintentionally. And I'm just wondering, for you, what's your advice to folks that looking to get into this work? What are sort of the principles, the values of solidarity that you see people really should embody to do this work in the right way?
Yeah, it's a really big question, because it's essentially how do you show up in a way in your life and in your work that supports and is good to people around you. And I feel like, I don't know if this is not a critique of the question at all, but it's there's also an implication, right, in this question that we're talking about white people.
Yeah.
We're talking about men, or we're talking about people who maybe have a pattern, if you look at the broad strokes of history, of not being so good to the people around them, or unintentionally, or maybe sometimes intentionally harming the people around them. And I guess that's the first thing I would say, is that I think that intention does matter. I think you're right that the road to hell can be paved with good intentions, and yet I think that I, at the end of the day, feel like anybody who goes into something as heart-driven as the well-being of others, which is really what this is about, right? And the well-being of the places we live. I think that coming from the heart is a really important piece of it. And I think that's especially important to keep in mind when, we're speaking at a conference hosted at MIT, right? I think that very often the mind, the head, the brain is the thing that is, valued most. Who's the smartest person, or who can solve the problem the best. And I think that that's important. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that a lot of these problems are really big and intractable, and we need the brightest minds we can find to focus on them. But at the end of the day, in my personal experience, and I think that this is probably shared by other people, what comes from the heart is equally, if not more, important, especially in a line of work. In particular, I would say the line of work that I've chosen to go into, a line of work that, broadly speaking, is interested in social change. That can be a really hard. That could be a really hard thing for the heart, because the reality of politics and society is that most efforts to change things fail, right? Most activists lose their campaigns. It is a very low batting average sport. And if you're going to, and I think that's true for people who maybe wouldn't even consider themselves activists either. I think that if you're in a corporation or a government institution, in any number of different industries, right? If you're trying to change things, it's hard to change things. Things don't want to change quite often. There is definitely inertia in these institutions that makes them very obstinate to transformation. And I think that it's just at the most basic level important to take care of yourself and one another if you are in a community that is interested in that. Because what I have seen, unfortunately, is that quite often, people come into something, in particular, I found this very true of younger activists, and when I was a student engaged in student activism, this was quite true. We would try to change something, it maybe wouldn't fully work out the way that we had hoped, and then people would, get frustrated, not just with the institution, but also with each other. And I think that at the most basic level, I think you gotta, to push through those kinds of things and to live a life that, is concerned with these sorts of issues. I think that you gotta come from the heart. You gotta think about other people's heart as well.
Yeah. Yeah, the question around intent versus impact, right, is always one that there are so many conversations over the past 5-10 years that I've been involved in. Defocusing on intent versus really focusing on what your actual impact is, and hearing that impact and creating these. We need sort of cultural change in where we're able to hold people accountable, but give people feedback with love. Especially in sort of the environmental movement, I feel like there's been a lack of that culture, a lot of defensiveness of, movements in communities that are white-led, coming from communities of color, from poor communities that have been really advocating for a shift in the power dynamic, not only with the opposition, with who are against the fossil fuel industry, but also within the movement. I'm just, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I often think of, I think it's Dr. Martin Luther King who once said, those who want peace must organize as well as those who want war. What we're up against is a very pun intended, well-oiled machine, right? How do you see our movement evolving and becoming more organized, really thinking about the impact that we have on one another within our communities, in between communities? Where do you see there room for growth in understanding? Where do you see self-care and community care playing a role? If we're going to take on these, as you said, the most powerful industry in the history of humanity, what are the key ingredients you see that we need to really focus on as a community, as a movement that is trying to save the planet?
So a lot of the environmental justice movement and indigenous rights movement that I've seen and participated in has, for good reason, through this point in history, been focused on stopping things, on saying no, on critiquing the systems and structures and infrastructure in particular that is being built or that we have inherited. And I just want to say that in a lot of ways that makes perfect sense, right? If there's a pipeline that is going to be built through your people's burial grounds and through your water supply and through your treaty lands against your wishes, the natural thing to do is to stand up and say, we do not stand for this, and this better not happen. And we're gonna literally put our bodies on the line to try to make it not happen. The thing that I think develops, for better or worse, I think that this is just a reality, when your dominant social, political posture is one of no, of stop, of critique, is that it's hard to learn then to do what we need to do now in the broadest sense as a global society, which is to build a lot of new things, both literally in terms of physical infrastructure, and then also I would say in terms of new social infrastructure, new community infrastructure. There is one set of, I think, postures that are very common in the environmental and climate justice movement, and environmental movement also, that I see, that are about stopping things. And there's a whole subset of, I think, habits of mind and organizational systems and all sorts of things like that that are quite underdeveloped around building new things, and what it might look like to, for example, despite the unfortunate and overwhelming whiteness of the history of the environmental movement, what it might look like for environmental and climate justice leaders to take a more prominent role in a shared environmental movement at a moment in history where, yes, climate change and environmental degradation are disproportionately going to harm the poor, people of color, indigenous people, people in the global south, island nations, etc. But it is still a common, if there's any problem that is truly a global problem that is shared by everybody, not equally, but shared by everybody, this is one where we also need to, we need to be able to acknowledge these histories of inequality and prejudice and bias that are still present in a lot of these spaces, but also figure out how to work together, how to collaborate, how to build something together, how to get to yes on certain things. And I think that just looking at different coalitions that my friends are parts of, at how difficult it can be for people to work across differences when there is a history of and arguably still a reality of institutional racism. I think that that's a very significantly challenging problem. How do you get, for example, the workers who build pipelines and the communities who do not want those pipelines to be built to find common ground and build something together? And that is, for example, like that problem, that coalition problem, is one that exists right now in the broader networks of the Democratic Party, right? Like the activists who want to stop pipelines are part of the broader networks of the Democratic Party, and the workers who often work and build those pipelines, and their unions in particular, are also part of that same, broadly speaking, political network and project. And how do you figure out the ways for people on such opposite ends of these issues to come together and build something? I think that that's one of our greatest challenges, for sure.
Yeah, so the idea of a just transition is finally sort of coming to, I don't want to say the mainstream, but it's started gaining momentum, right? Like, how do we make this transition from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy? How do we look at the plight of labor and workers who, their life's work, their lifeline, what puts food on their table is sometimes to no fault of their own in the jobs are jobs. Jobs are in the extractive industries. And how do we transition to something renewable where we center workers, we center communities of color? Do you think the idea of a just transition in 2022, like, where do you see the state of that movement?
The question of what happens to the workers in industries that have no future or a much more limited future, or certainly a transformed future as we decarbonize, the economy is, I think, one of the most significant questions that, broadly speaking, our democracy and society and other democracies and societies that are facing this challenge, must address. And I just think, firstly, I just want to, there's a sort of inherited, broadly held view that the transition to clean and renewable energy is inevitably going to turn those workers against the forces and political parties that are in favor of that transition. And I think that that is true if you look at particular, there's some evidence that suggests that that's true in particular contexts, but it's not true in others in ways that I think is worth just sitting with. So for example, if you look at the north of England or West Virginia or Wyoming, right, all these places where coal mining is a significant industry, then you could identify, pretty clearly, a shift towards more conservative politics as, coal mining declines in those places, and, those things are clearly, to a certain extent, correlated political, economic phenomena. And yet, if you look at some other contexts where coal mining is just as much a significant part of the economy, so for example, the Navajo Nation in New Mexico and Arizona, the Crow Nation in Montana, there seems to be actually not as much of a connection between a transitioning industry and whether or not those workers sort of turn against the political forces most associated with that transition. The Navajo Nation, which just closed its very significant coal-fired power plant, which was in a lot of ways the core of its energy economy and its, just broadly speaking, its economy since sort of the post-war to the present. It just shuttered a mine and its coal-fired power plant in the last 3 years. It voted 84% for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party in the 2020 election. And that is not a story that you often hear told in the context of what happens to the coal workers in their communities in a moment of transition, what happens to the fossil fuel workers in their communities in a moment of transition. And so obviously, this is a very significant, very, very significant problem that deserves focus. And frankly, I also think that workers who may lose their jobs, may lose the benefits, may lose their pensions, all these sorts of challenges. Like, I think that they have every right to be angry about that. They have every right to be frustrated. What I'm curious about, though, is the instances where that frustration did not transform necessarily into backlash. And there's so much attention, the point I'm making is that there's so much attention paid to the places where there was a backlash to transition and to the social, political forces, cultural forces that are associated with it, and not as much attention to the places where there wasn't, or there doesn't appear to have been as strong of one. And I think, broadly, what I'm also saying here is that, like, social science is a big part of the question of decarbonizing the economy. How do people respond to these changes, right? That's like essentially like the core of what you're asking. And I'd be very curious to see more social science and more studies of these other examples of industries and communities and places in transition where the dominant narrative is not necessarily, does not necessarily fit those cases, and better understanding of why that might be, because I think that is essentially right, like what we need in a broader social context. We need more examples of transitions that are just and where people do not, where there is not a backlash against that transition, where things go on. And I think that there is, from my reading, There's not enough of that kind of study.
You know, the subtitle of the summit is Understanding the Ground, and I think you've done a fantastic job of helping us understand the foundation of so many of these issues. And obviously what needs to happen is massive, and it has to happen on a scale that's never been happened before. There is a massive global movement currently organizing on the ground, really rooted by those most impacted by climate change, by environmental changes. And so for the audience, for everyone that's going into this day, really trying to further their understanding of these issues and really finding their role in addressing these issues. What's your advice for folks going into the day, what they should be looking for? I fully believe that there's a role for everyone. I love direct action. That's who I am. I love when communities of color and frontline communities organize together and put their bodies and livelihoods on the line to stop injustice. That's the role that I love for myself and the folks that I work with. And it's how I see communities of color, frontline communities have always, I see direct action as a key component throughout history of that struggle, but there's so many other ones. So for folks going into today, what's sort of your advice for them to go into the day to find their role within this movement?
So if you look at any sort of survey data of whether people trust their neighbors, and you look at the way that people responded, in 2020 versus the way that they may have responded in 1980, what you'll see is that people trust their neighbors a lot less today than they did 40 years ago. Which the reason I bring up, that empirical reality is that I think that we're living in a moment where community, the basic human relationships that have sustained our very complicated societies for millennia since we emerged as a species, is breaking down in a really fundamental way. And I think that all of this, taking on a big environmental problems, taking on something as large as climate change, requires collective action, which requires in turn community. It requires people to be able to be in relationship with each other, to do things that they could not do alone, to be more than just themselves. And I feel as though I'm a writer by profession and disposition, so I spend a lot of time in my head and plugging away at a computer and alone. It's a fairly solitary thing. And yet, I could not do what I do. In fact, I would not be here today if it were not for other people and community. The reason I got hooked up with the folks here at MIT was through one of my best friends, a friend who I actually met through the indigenous rights movement, the environmental justice movement, whatever you want to call it, named Jade Begay. She's the one who connected me to the organizers of this conference. And I think that what I would say is that it's really important to, if you don't feel connected to community, to try to find ways to reconnect. I think it's especially a very hard time, obviously, during this pandemic to have that. And I think that is a very essential building block to taking on all of these challenges. But that also, I would say that from my personal experience, I have, and we were talking about a mutual connection friend of ours, Jamie Henn earlier. I have definitely also made friends in community through getting involved in you know, the climate movement, the environmental movement, the climate justice movement, the environmental justice movement, the indigenous rights movement, all these sorts of, you know, conjoining networks of people. And, you know, I guess I would just encourage people to do that, to, you know, get involved and to get involved with other people, to choose to go into this line of work in a way that, you know, brings you in contact with other people who become your friends, who become your community. And, you know, it's hard to do that in this day and age, right? Like, there's so many ways that you can feel as though you're contributing or doing activism where you're behind your screen or your keyboard, and at the end of the day, there is very little human connection that happens. And there also might be reasons why, you know, in this day and age, you might not want to be close to other people when there's a deadly pathogen around the world. But I do think that thing, you know, coming together, forming community, maintaining community, rebuilding community, is really, really essential to all of this. And it's really core to what I do, for sure, and I'm incredibly grateful for it every day.
That was wonderful, Julian. Thank you so much. I learned a ton. Hope everyone else did as well. There's a full day planned ahead. Hope everyone enjoys it. I sure will.
Well, thank you, Saif and Julian. That was so lovely to hear that conversation. And so we have about 10 minutes to take a little bit of Q&A. So I will just go ahead and get started on that and let you two kind of take them as they make sense. So the first question that has come up is the US/Canada environmental indigenous movement connected at all to similar movements in Latin America, like Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, or others? You know, do those movements talk to each other? Are there active links? Would just love to hear any thoughts that you have there, Julian.
Sure thing. And just want to say that if my answers aren't particularly sharp, it's because it's 7 in the morning where I am on the West Coast. So there are some connections between indigenous movements in Latin America, South America, and North America. There's obviously a bit of a language barrier, but there are often delegations of activists that I know of that have gone down to the Amazon and to other places in Latin and South America to learn from and share with activists down there. There's actually a group that went back in, I think it was August, to Brazil for what was the largest indigenous rights protest, I believe, in Brazilian history back in August. I was related to what's going on in the Amazon. And I was invited to, the only reason I bring that up is that I was invited to participate in that, although I didn't get to go because I had some prior commitments at the time. So there's certainly connections between indigenous communities in North and South America and Latin America and the movements as well.
Thank you for that. So second question, and I think, you know, both you and Saif can talk to this a little bit. So there is a lot of conversation around institutions, wondering about the role and status, real and perceived, of grassroots collective action when working with / within the within these institutions. What are some core tensions between this approach to change and institutions and how to navigate them?
Should I go first, or Saif, do you want to take on? Okay. So I guess I'll answer this one with just sort of a brief anecdote about a current example of this. So the current Secretary of Interior of the United States is the first Native American cabinet secretary in our nation's history. She, I would say, is about as activist as you could imagine anybody reaching the executive in our nation's government being. She literally went to the camps erected in the path of the Dakota Access Pipeline and cooked green chili stew and tortillas for water protectors. And if you look at her legislative record and the kind of bills that she was sponsoring related to the environment when she was in the Congress, her activism on that issue and her advocacy on those issues did not end at Standing Rock. She very much brought that with her to Washington, D.C. And just the reality of the way that institutions work is, of course, she now runs the executive branch of the government that is in charge of managing about a fifth of our nation's landmass, vast stores of natural resources, as well as the nation-to-nation relationship with the more than 560 federally recognized tribes across the country. And yet, because of the sort of institutional inertia of a big government agency like the Department of the Interior, and also because of some specific political realities, and also just basic relationship realities. Secretary Holland, unlike other cabinet secretaries, was not one of Biden's friends going back for decades. And if you look at sort of the folks who are around her in the Interior Department, they're certainly good people, but they're also from sort of an older guard of the Interior Department, more like the way that the department would have been staffed under someone like Ken Salazar. And for those reasons, as well as some political pressures on Interior to, in particular from the senator from Alaska, as well as from West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, Interior hasn't been able to follow through on some of the more activist originated demands that were put on the Biden campaign and the Biden administration. So for example, there was originally in Biden's campaign platform a commitment to pause drilling and leasing on public lands in the United States, and that is something that the administration has actually not followed through on. And I would say that it was worth and is still worthwhile getting someone like Secretary Holland into the leadership of that agency. It's obviously a historic thing. I think that she's doing, she's making change just merely by her presence, as well as through her policy making on other issues. But it would also be totally accurate to say that there are constraints to, the sorts of change that she was able to make by being put at the head of an agency, which I think is a very humbling reality for those of us who are very serious about advocating for change. There are things that are worth fighting for. I think that putting Secretary Holland at the head of the Interior Department was something that was worth fighting for, and I would fight for it again without a doubt. But the realities of politics and these institutions is that they were set up to constrain change to a certain extent. And so it's a constant grind and a constant push forward. And, it's always an impartial victory, unfortunately, in this line of work. But that just means that we got to push harder tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, not much to add. I just think as someone, I'll take it from the perspective of someone that works at a company that is very successful and has a lot of economic, social power. One of the questions that I have gotten asked the most on strategy is, whether or not young folks or whoever should take an inside strategy or an outside strategy, and what's more powerful to getting to your end goal. Should I join the institutions and try to change them from the inside, or is outside pressure going to cause change faster? And my answer has always been relatively the same, even though it's evolved over the past 10 years or so, that the onus is on big, powerful institutions to change. Right. And if you're inside those institutions, like I'm inside a company that makes a lot of money, sells goods, ships them around the world, causes harm, is to do everything you can to cause the least amount of harm while doing the most amount of good, knowing that, there's a lot of myths around sustainability and the ability for people with so much institutional power to be able to create change from the ground up. Like that's never going to happen, right? So our role is to think about what are our values and principles of solidarity. How do we align ourselves with the folks that we believe should be the agents of change and have the wisdom, the knowledge, the creativity, the imagination to create a new and better world. And that's not going to come obviously from the top down, but it's going to come from the bottom up. And so figuring out that relationship and what sort of the values and principles you are to establishing those relationships and being really led by those values and principles of solidarity is absolutely key for those that do hold and are within institutions of power. And I think that's my onus. That's my job at Patagonia to help Patagonia do that. I've been on both sides of that equation. I believe in, like I said in the talk, in direct action and confronting those traditional powers of institution directly from the outside. And that's where I think the vast majority of support should be. But that's not to say that institutional change cannot happen from the inside. You just really need to be guided by principles and values because it's so easy to sell out. It is so easy to be perverted and persuaded by those traditional systems of hierarchy. And that's why they exist, and that's why they're so powerful.
Thank you for that, Julian and Saif. I really appreciate that. I think it's important for people to keep that in mind. We unfortunately have 1 minute left. This was super quick. But I think just before we close, I would love to hear from each of you, just one quick take of one thing that either you personally, in regards to everything we've talked about, are either excited about taking on and working on right now, or a challenge that you are trying to grapple with, just to leave people sort of ruminating as we go through the rest of the day. Maybe Saif, we can start with you. Saif, you're muted.
Oh, whoops. That was bound to happen. The past couple of years have obviously been truly hard for so many people across the world. And I think it has taught us so many lessons. And I really do believe that, Julian did such a beautiful job of pointing this out, that, the state of today's movement is not just sort of dismantling the old, but building the new. And I see like the creativity and imagination and people centering art and just new ways of thinking and writing, really embedding that into the movement to be able to imagine a world that has never existed before. Just that amount of creativity is really inspiring to me and really is what brings me a smile every single day that I wake up in the morning.
For me, I think the thing that I'm constantly trying to nurture and work on is community. I recently relocated back to the West Coast, which is where I'm originally from. And I no longer live in the city. So I can't just like walk down to the coffee shop or hop on my bike and see, friends and colleagues who are around my age. And so I'm trying to be a lot more purposeful about the connections that I make and maintain, and how you make sure that you cultivate that kind of family, the chosen family sort of around you, in addition to the sort of one family that you're one